we'll get going. Tonight's conversation is going to be about gift requests and how to make the ask. It was the same topic that we covered last week, but because turnout was low due to Holy Week, we've decided it's such an important topic that we're going to go ahead and repeat the session so that more of you have the opportunity to hear about it. So before we get going, I'm going to hand it over to Father Dave to lead us in prayer and open things up.
Thank you, Jess, and welcome everyone. According to my records, this is our 27th training session with our friends and partners from CCS. So it's good to welcome you, especially our those from St. Augustine. They get the award for the most participants in tonight's meeting. So happy Easter to everyone, and it's good to see you. Let us pray. God of abundance, we thank you for the gift of this magnificent spring day and for our partnership in ministry in the Diocese of New Jersey. We thank you for the special joy and significance of this Easter season when you call your people to show forth in our lives what we profess by our faith. Move us, we pray, to give as we have received, abundantly, generously, joyfully, even recklessly, that your people may grow in grace, your church may prosper, and our common ministry may ever bear witness to your unfailing grace. We pray this prayer in the name of the three in whom we are one, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
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 Thank you, Father Dave.
You're welcome.
All right, so last month, if those of you who are on the call joined us, we spoke about the pre-ask meeting and how to actually schedule a conversation where you're going to ask someone for a gift. And today we're actually going to talk about how you make that gift request. We're going to hopefully give you some tactical tools and language to just start warming you up to the role that you might play in these conversations, whether alone or most likely with a team. So we'll talk about how to prepare, how to actually make the gift request, and how to close the gift. But before we tuck in, can we take down the presentation just for one moment? I just want to see everyone's face for a second. For those of you who are on camera, by a show of hands or a nod, how many of you have actually participated in a gift request before? Okay, great. So I'm seeing a few hands. How many of you are nervous about this? Okay. Is anyone excited about it, about the opportunity?
I'm excited. You can't
Great.
see me, but.
Okay. No, that's great. It's just helpful to know sort of where everyone's at in this. So we have some people who have done it before. Most people are nervous. Some people are excited. And that's great. And hopefully we'll calm some of the nerves tonight. We'll continue on with the excitement, and we'll give you the tools, and we can always follow up after. Okay, are there any particular concerns before we get going that anyone wants to share? No? That's all right too. We'll hopefully cover the silent secret concerns. Evelyn, we can throw up the presentation again. Thank you very much. We'll go to the slide that's titled Basics. All right. So I know that for those of you who've attended the trainings before, probably very familiar with the slide by now. You've seen it before, we've talked through it before, but I actually think it's just a helpful reminder to continue to look at it and to really think about the psychology of the donor and think about why people give, right? We know that people give to people, they give because they're asked, they give to a winning cause, they respond well to a specific request. But tonight we've highlighted two different boxes. Sometimes we highlight people give to people and personal gifts, which are also important, but I've purposely highlighted that the first one on the right are the best solicitors are donors themselves. And that's because the easiest and best thing to do as a laity and actually even as a clergy member, is to start with your own gift. And I say this because it actually helps overcome nearly every objection that someone might raise in a meeting, right? When you can say, I felt the same way, or, I grappled with this decision, but here's why I ultimately decided to move forward with a gift. Or I don't know about you, but if you're able to do it, I don't know what you're able to do, but this is what we did. I think it just goes a lot further. It's those of you from St. Augustine's would have heard this the other night. It's a lot easier to say, join me, right? Than it is to just ask someone for a gift without having given yourself. And the second thing is that we've highlighted is that people give because they're asked, right? We know that. And that's what we're really here to talk about today. It's how to make the ask, how to feel comfortable making the ask. There's a lot of fear associated with making a gift request. But actually there's a pretty natural flow and there's an order to it. And really, ultimately, it just comes down to practice. I once worked with a principal of a Jesuit school in Ireland who was absolutely terrified to ask parents to donate above and beyond their annual giving campaign or above and beyond what they were paying for tuition. And so he and I practiced for a week straight. We did some role playing, and, the first few asks, 4 out of 5 of them were successful. He got 1 rejection, which in the end he realized wasn't actually so bad. And it wound up being his absolute favorite thing to do. And it's really comes down to that he believed so much in what he was asking for. The children's education, the facilities at the school. And because he believed in that so much, it became quite natural and exciting to share the vision and to make that ask. Before we move on, I know Father Dave also has a story about the ask, and so I'm going to ask him to share that before we move on.
Okay, thanks, Jess. Before I entered the priesthood, I worked as a major gift fundraiser for 2 organizations, Habitat for Humanity International and World Vision. And I'll always remember the first ask that I ever made of a major donor when I was working for Habitat for Humanity. At that time, I was the executive director of the local Habitat affiliate in Portland, Maine. And we were a very small operation. We built maybe 1 or 2 houses every year. And we were experiencing some financial difficulties. And so I came up with this idea of asking our vendors, those businesses that we did business with in the community, if they would support the work of Habitat. So we had one particular vendor. It was a small family-owned lumber company called Hancock Lumber Company. So we did about $5,000 worth of business with them every year. We bought building materials from them. So I decided to go and ask, I made an appointment with Kevin Hancock, who was the president and CEO of the company, and I was going to ask him for $500. Well, I gathered up all my courage. This was my very first major ask of a major donor, and I went into his office, and before I even had a chance to ask him, he said, Dave, we've decided to give the equivalent of what it would cost to build 1 house for Habitat each year. And at that time, it was costing us about $50,000 to build a house. So I was going to ask him for $500. And he told me his company was going to give $50,000, not just once, but every year. And as far as I know, that was back in the early 1990s. Hancock Lumber has continued to give at that rate. So they've probably given more than $1 million over that period of time. But it was what Kevin said to me after he made that commitment that I will never forget as long as I live. He said, Dave, I've been waiting for someone from Habitat to ask me for 5 years to do this. And you're the first one that's ever come and actually asked me to do it. And that reminds me always, when I think of that story, how important it is to just ask people. Sometimes we're so, especially in the church, we're so timid about asking people, but people are waiting to be asked. And if we don't ask them, oftentimes they won't give. So just as the slide indicates, people give because they're asked to give. And we need to be bold and courageous in our asking for people to invest in the ministry of Christ Church in this day and in this time. So that's my story, and I'm sticking with it.
Thanks, Father Dave. I think it's such an important story. So thank you. Let's move along to the next slide, please. All right. So preparing for the gift request, right? Preparing is just so important. And we should really all approach major and legacy gifts as well, those prospects as thoughtfully and as strategically as we possibly can, right? And there's a step-by-step process for conducting a solicitation visit, which, if implemented effectively, will most likely lead to a successful decision from the potential donor. There's a good amount of prep work before you want to make an ask, and that's because by the time you're making the request, you should really already know a good bit about the prospect, and they will know that it's a gift request meeting, right? We don't want to do the surprise attack route or the bait and switch. We don't want this to feel manipulative when you walk into the meeting. It should be a really honest process that makes everyone feel at ease. And that's one of the reasons that we encourage people to have some of those pre-ask meetings and start talking to people ahead of the gift request, because that's where you're starting to share the vision. You're really listening and you're asking questions so that by the time you walk into the meeting where you're going to make the gift request, you more or less know what they're interested in and what they could potentially give. So on the slide here, we've shared 10 questions. And ideally, ahead of any conversation that you're going to have, you're going to know the answers to most, if not all, of these questions. And that's through research, but it's also through those pre-ask conversations that we spoke about a few weeks ago. So questions you're going to ask, right? Do we know as much as we need to about the potential donor, right? Who they are, where they work, how many family members there are, if they have children that will need to go to college soon that they're supporting, who's the best person or the team to make this gift request, right? Who do they respond well to? Is it the clergy member? Is it a clergy member and a volunteer, or a particular member of the vestry? Who is it that's going to help influence the gift making decision? Who else in the congregation is given at a similar level, and can their gift be leveraged to raise the sights of this person? How much are you going to ask for? Common mistakes include not asking for the gift specifically and leaving it up to the donor to be inspired to give whatever they can. And as a result, many well-intentioned volunteers or clergy members are actually puzzled when they don't actually secure a gift that they were seeking, right? People generally appreciate the clarity associated with a very specific request, because that's going to allow them to respond with some form of yes or possibly even no, but at least you'll know. You'll want to know, have they given before? If so, what have they given, at what level, and maybe where else do they, besides the church, do they support other local causes? This is all going to help you really determine the right appropriate gift request. And what is it that's resonating with them about the vision for the congregation, for the church, for the case for support? Are they going to want any recognition, and what honoring opportunities might actually be appropriate to present? And I do just want to emphasize this. Often people will say in conversation, no, I don't want any recognition. I don't want to be recognized for the gift, but everyone should at the very least be offered an opportunity to be thanked, whether it's publicly through a newsletter. Most people might, many people will say no. But it's always important to offer that. And then what's the actual strategy, right? Who's going to be in the room? Who's going to say what? And we'll get to that next. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so focus on what you can control, right? In every single conversation, whether it's a gift request or not, there are going to be things that you can actually control, and then there are going to be things that you can't control. So you won't ever fully know a person or a family's financial situation and how much they can give. Make a good guess, but you don't actually know. You won't know how they're going to react or what questions they're going to ask. But you can be prepared to make the case. You can be prepared to make a specific request, and you can control the setting, right? The time, how well you're actually listening and reacting to both visual and verbal cues. And you can start thinking about the questions that they might ask and preempt them in the conversation, or even draft your own internal frequently asked questions document ahead of time, with the vestry, with the clergy, so that you're able to answer questions pretty readily, or at the very least, if you don't know the answer, to be able to say, let me get back to you, and you can respond after the meeting. This internal FAQ document can actually be really helpful. It's something that we're doing with Episcopal Community Services, myself and Father Dave, and some of our other CCS colleagues. And that's just to make sure that everyone can preempt some of those questions that are starting to come up in conversations. Evelyn, you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so as I said, one of the easiest things that you can control for is where the gift request meeting actually takes place. It seems very simple, but this can, have a pretty big impact on the flow of the conversation, the mood, how people react. There's no one right answer, right? There's more than one ways to skin a cat. It's really up to you and to find, a style that works for you and makes you most comfortable and effective. But it can be really helpful in determining the tone for the meeting. So I would suggest you'll pretty much always want to do a gift request in a quiet and an undisturbed place. So an office, a private room in the church. Right now over Zoom, in pre-COVID times, we would suggest actually going to someone's home, because it elevates the importance of the conversation, and it shows that you're making the effort to go to them. I would advise not having this conversation in a really busy location like a restaurant or at a reception right after church when everyone's standing around. And that's because money is a really important and a very personal topic. And when you're asking for a decision on a big gift, whether it's a gift or a legacy gift, you don't want others to be listening in. You want them to feel comfortable pausing, thinking. You want to have their full attention, and you want them to have your full attention. You also want to think about the team, and we would typically suggest that it's two people, right? A clergy member and a vestry member, for example. And each of you will have your own portion of the presentation, or you'll know your roles. But really the reason that we suggest having two people is that two people means there's two sets of ears that are actually listening and picking up on those cues, listening to the questions they're asking, watching and seeing how people are reacting. And that can be really helpful, because a lot of this is just common sense and playing off, what cues people are giving you. You can play around with different formats, right? Sometimes it's helpful to have an actual presentation on paper or on Zoom to help guide the conversation. It can be formal, but sometimes formality isn't the best way. And sometimes it's just helpful to have a conversation, and maybe you reiterate that ask later with a letter. But I'll say it's always helpful if you're prepared ahead of time with talking points, particularly if it's a team, know who's saying what. And last but not least, making that ask is just so important, right? We know it's always easier to make that request in writing, to send a letter asking someone for money. Definitely easier. But if you think about it from your own perspective, right? Would you rather a friend ask you for a favor in writing or in person and in the context of a conversation, right? And that's why we really recommend having a conversation. And you can follow that up by a written request reiterating what you've asked for. Next slide, please. So, okay, your personal preparation. Not to beat a dead horse, but preparation is just so important. As the ability to just successfully present a major or a planned gift request is really largely based on your ability to communicate the importance of it, not only enthusiastically, but also with credibility. So first, you'll want to prepare the case for support. very carefully, presented in a convincing way, and really without apology. I'm going to keep saying that because I find that in gift request meetings, people have a tendency to ask and then apologize for the ask. But try to keep this in mind, right? When you're asking for a gift, it's for your congregation, right? You are visiting with people who already faithfully support the church. And the case for support that you're presenting is strongly supported, it's worthwhile, it's relevant, and it's something that you believe in, right? So you want to be familiar enough with these materials to be able to answer simple questions about the various case components. You want to make sure your research is up to date, you know about the family. If you're part of the team, it's because you're the best person for the job, right? You've already made that determination. And lastly, again, know what you're asking ahead of time. Be prepared when you walk into the meeting, know that amount that you're asking for, and know the amount that you're gonna accept. And we can get to that a little bit later. Next slide. So role play. Feel like everyone here just tensed up a little bit. I promise you we are not going to do this today, but I will always be an advocate and a champion of role playing, right? It is so helpful to rehearse and practice your requests with others. For many of us here, it's not actually our day job to ask someone for money. We're not all major gift officers. It's my day job, but I still role play and I practice, especially if I'm going into a room with someone else. You want to know who's saying what. In time, you're going to develop a little bit of a shtick. You'll have your roles figured out. And that can be just so helpful. So you're not fumbling over each other and looking at each other like, oh, are you going to say that? Am I going to say that? Who's going to make the actual ask? So just practice and feel comfortable practicing. Maybe at a later session, we might spend time on this and break out. But always know that, CCS or the project resource team as part of the diocese, we're here to help you with this. So if you do want to role play and you don't feel comfortable doing it with each other, feel free to reach out to me. Feel free to reach out to Evelyn, who's also on the call, or Father Dave, and we'd all be very happy to help you with this. All right, the next slide. Thank you. Actually, before we get on to this, I just want to stop for 1 second and see if there are any initial questions or thoughts before we actually get into the gift request.
This is Shirley. Hi. I'm still stuck back on, and I think you explained it, but maybe just a further explanation on determining how much you're going to ask for. Father David said that he was going in to ask for 500. How do you get to 500? I mean, where does that? I mean, obviously you're going to know your parishioner to some extent in terms of how much they've been giving, how much they've done, maybe over and above that. But is there like a range, a ballpark? Where is that number coming from?
Yeah.
Where's that amount coming from?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And I think that can be one of the hardest things to determine. There are a number of different things that you can look at to make that determination of what you're going to request. So one of the things which is really important is how much do you need, right? How much do you need to raise? And then you could start breaking that down to see, okay, if I need to raise $6,000, how many gifts and at what level do I actually need to get me to that? Okay. So you can start building out what we would call a table of gifts, a very simple chart that shows, okay, how many gifts, what level, how many at each level, the total is $6,000, right? So you could start there. And then you want to look at your congregation and see if you have access to what people have been giving in the past. That is a good indication it's a good starting point to see. But we also know that some people have been giving the same amount for years and years and years, and that's because no one's ever asked them to do more. So you want to start, it's hard because you're never actually going to know what someone can give, but you just, within your vestry, you want to start thinking through, looking maybe where they live, what they're involved in. You can Google to see if they sit on boards of other charitable organizations and if they support them. But sometimes it's through those pre-ask conversations that you can help start getting a gauge of what someone might come in at. And how you can do that is in those pre-ask conversations that you're sharing the vision and you're talking to them about the need. You can start sharing that table of gifts and really say, for us to reach our goal, these are sort of the levels that we need our community to come in at. Like, how
And I
does this
think
look to you?
we've done that on several occasions, and I think Carol Ann just put something in the chat, but
Oh,
we've done that for several major projects, whether it's the roof that we need for the church, or whether it's new restroom facilities, or I don't know, new kitchen, whatever. So we've done that. So you're suggesting that that is part of the calculation of what one needs to think about and
yeah.
relate
Well,
that back to the congregation.
yeah. So when you're having these one-on-one conversations, not in the ask meeting, but before that, you can share some of those levels and say, what do you think about these levels? Could you see yourself giving it? Like, we really need leadership gifts. Could you see yourself stepping up as a leader? And, how do you feel about these levels? And sometimes people will self-select and say, yeah, I can see myself in the top one or two levels. Like, I think I can stretch this year. And sometimes they'll say, that is so out of my ability right now. And they'll share a little bit more about what they're going through. And then you'll sort of have an indication from there going into the next meeting of what they might be able to give. But again, it's a little bit of that. It's a little bit about talking,
Okay.
trying to figure things out. And then from there, it's a little bit of a guess. But I will say it's very rare that someone is going to be offended if you ask for too much. The bigger risk is to ask for too little. If you ask for too much, someone is going to say, I can't do that, but I can do this, right? But if you ask for $50,000 and they have, or $50 and they actually have the ability to give 500, it's very rare. I mean, Father Dave's story is incredible. It is very rare that someone is going to say, no, I can quadruple what you're going to ask me for and give 50,000, right? It happens sometimes, but it's very rare, and it's very rare for an individual in particular to do that.
Yeah, and I would add that in response to Shirley's question, I think coming up with the amount, it's an art rather than a science. There's no formula that you can kind of plug in and you come up with. So you do the research, as much research as you can, but ultimately it's a guess, it's an estimate. And you ask people, this is what we would like to ask you to consider, prayerfully consider. And then you close your mouth. You wait until the donor makes a response to that request. But there's no magical formula that you can plug someone's numbers into and then it tells you exactly how much you should ask for. It's kind of it's an art rather than a science. And the more you do it, the more comfortable you become with making that request.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And this is Diane. From St. Alex. I wanted to follow up on the request and just state that the majority of people in our congregation are retired, and they're up in age, and on fixed incomes. And that's where my head is right now, thinking about that and how and where to go in with requesting a particular amount when we know already that these people, many are on fixed incomes. And for example, when we were speaking about we had special projects and things that needed to be addressed, people came forward and we had like each project done. And right now we're in another situation where we need a generator. And this is present. And the cost of the generator is like $10,000. That was what was discussed. And we're going to have to figure out how we can do that or get something less expensive. But is there a certain way that we should approach individuals that are up in age and are on fixed incomes? Is there a little way you can help clarify that one for me?
Yeah, I mean, That's a tough question because again, like you'll never fully know what someone's ability is. And that's why I'm a big advocate for having some of those pre-conversations and have people start self-identifying where they might come in. Um, it's hard. I mean, we have the ability to do some research. Like we have access to some databases and we'd be happy to help you look through to see if there's some further information that's pulled from publicly available information. That is one thing we've done for some congregations is to put people through wealth screening, which is you kind of use it as a grain of salt. But it can be a helpful starting point. And then there's always, of course, the option of having conversations about planned gifts, right? Because most people have the ability to give something towards the end of their life or in death, right? And we spoke to St. Augustine's about that this week. And that's, sometimes in these conversations, you can talk about both. If you're asking someone for a major gift, you can talk about the flexibility of how you receive the gift. And sometimes it can be a blend, right? You can ask someone for a combination of a planned gift and a gift now. Or you can give that option. I mean, it doesn't solve the immediate broiler issue, but it can help ensure some future sustainability of the congregation.
And sometimes when someone's on a fixed income, it doesn't necessarily mean they couldn't do as much. Often, from my experience, they are also don't have as many expenses. They're no longer paying college tuition. They're no longer paying a mortgage. There are some other things so I think, just like Jess said, having some of these pre-conversations to feel people out is important. Because I don't think you can make assumptions just based on one or two things.
Yeah, and I would also add, what we're talking about tonight are mostly major donors. We're not talking about, people who would have the capacity to give $50 or $100. We're talking about donors who have a higher capacity. So this is you're not going to be visiting every single member of the parish and asking them to make a significant gift. I think that's important to recognize that we're talking primarily about, and how you define a major donor. It depends on the organization. When I worked for Habitat for Humanity, we said a major donor was anyone who gave more than $5,000 a year. But that wouldn't apply to many churches. For many churches, maybe a major donor is someone who contributes $500 or $1,000 a year. But these visits and the requests that we're talking about tonight are for primarily for your major contributors, not for every single parishioner in the parish that's giving.
Carolyn, before we move on, did you want to ask something? You're on mute.
Muted myself. Almost like a sales process, and that's because I've had that Dale Carnegie sales training. So if you identify the cause, the need, the item, you believe in it, you can convince people to join you in this endeavor. We, as Shirley mentioned, I think we redid the women of our church redid Our Lady's restroom. And we were told how much it was going to cost. And we were also told how much we would want everyone to give. Came up with the money. Then the challenge was to the men, because we were not redoing theirs, was to come up with enough money to redo the men's room. So it was, in fact, two teams with a purpose and a goal to come up with the funds to redo the bathrooms. So sometimes you need a stimulant to make this happen. And your mention of using the leadership type role model is a good thing. The other part of that too would be if you had a gold circle, silver circle, a bronze circle, maybe even a platinum circle for those individuals who aspire to be recognized in some significant way. But I'm happy to do role playing with members of my church because there is a way to do this. I went out, this was years ago, and sat at a church member's house for hours trying to get them to pledge. I wouldn't leave. That was not the way to do it. They pledged, but it was not the way to do it. So this can be done because we have a warmth and a desire to make it happen.
That's exactly right. I'm so glad to hear that you're offering role playing. That's wonderful. So let's move on because we do have a bit more to get through, and I think that's actually a really perfect transition to talk about some of the essential themes to communicate, right? So let's go through what the actual gift request looks like, and then we can pause again for further questions. All right. So as I said, each gift request has a few standard themes or a flow. And ultimately, the gift request should be presented as an invitation to a good friend, right? That's sort of just what Caroline was saying. And while we don't actually know what anyone is capable of giving, right? You do want to inform your fellow parishioners of the actual plans for the future of your church and really invite them to consider a specific request. So in every conversation, right, you're going to want to thank them for their past involvement or their support, to share the impact that their support might have. And you might even use it as an opportunity to share any recent accomplishments. It's a time to really communicate the vision for the future and the strategy to achieve those goals. Sometimes it's appropriate to actually share who else is involved. This can be used as leverage, if they give their consent to share their name or their amount. And it's a time to discuss the impact and the urgency. And again, while many people don't want recognition, we think it should be offered. And sometimes it can be in those giving circles or those gold, bronze, silver circles that Caroline was just talking about. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there are 5 key components to any gift request conversation, right? There's the opening, there's presenting the case, there's making the request, there's actually handling the responses, and then there's closing the gift. So we'll go through some of those. Great. So like any conversation, right, the opening niceties are going to help set the tone of the meeting, right? You want to portray an air of confidence. You want to be relaxed. You want to be pleasant. You want to start asking them questions about their day or their family. And after you get through some of that, to just really calm everyone and make everyone feel welcome and nice, then I always think actually the direct approach is sometimes the best approach, right? So when it does seem appropriate, you might begin the presentation or just the conversation by saying something like, John, Mary, I'm really glad that we can get together today because I have a really important matter to discuss with you regarding the plans for the future of our congregation. And I'd just like to take a moment to tell you where we are, where we're going, and what we hope to accomplish in the years ahead. I'd also like to discuss how you and your family might play a role in all of this. But first, let me discuss our situation, right? It's confident, it's unapologetic. Hopefully it seems pretty natural. And it's personal, right? You're using statements like our congregation, right? It's inclusive. Next slide, please. So then you have an opportunity to actually go into the details and present the case or what you're going to be asking for. As I said previously, sometimes you can use an actual document like a brochure, or a presentation to guide the conversation and share the needs. And you might say something as simple as, I personally have always thought that the congregation is really the center of our Christian life, right? I've been a member of St. Peter's for 15 years. And during that time, this congregation has had such an enormous impact on so many aspects of my life. And right now, we're hoping to raise a minimum of $1 million to really support our vision, right? The Reverend, our vestry, have developed a really great plan for how that money is going to be used. And I know you'd be really interested in hearing about it, right? And you might just provide some of the details about what the needs are and encourage a response or questions after you share some of those case components, because really you want this to be a conversation. Next slide. Okay, so after you present the case, that's when you want to make the actual request. And this is really the most important part of the meeting. And again, you don't want to apologize for it. You want to be clear, you want to be honest, and you want to include a direct call to action. You know, sometimes I actually like to couch it in 3 things. There's something about the psychology of asking someone to do 3 things that people are more likely to do one of the 3 things than to do none of the 3 things if you're asking them, right? So if, for example, you actually do have more than one request of someone, you might couch it in 3 things. So for example, you can say, you know, Carol Ann, I'd really like to ask you to do 3 things. You know, I'd like you to sit on our stewardship committee. I'd like you to join our next parish event where we're talking about planned giving. And I'd like you to consider a gift of XYZ. And we'll get into what that sentence looks like in question. You don't always have to take this approach. Not everyone would agree with me that this is the best approach, but sometimes I think it can be nice to couch it in 3 things. Next slide, please. So everyone has their own way of making the gift request. I would always recommend writing it down, practicing it. Feel really good about those words that you're going to say. Make sure it rolls off the tongue easily. Maybe it's not 1 sentence, maybe it's 3, right? You're going to prepare them, you're going to ask them, and you're going to provide options. So for example, my gift request sentences looks like this, right? I would say, you know, Donna, I have no way of knowing what your personal financial situation is. But I do know that in order for us to succeed, you know, we're going to need some historic support from a number of our parishioners. We need families and gifts at this level to assist in laying a foundation for the remainder of the congregation and the success of our efforts. So I'd like to ask you to prayerfully consider a pledge of $200 per month over a 5-year period for a total pledge of $12,000. And I'd be happy to work with you on the timing and the payment options. And then you stop talking. It's direct, it's to the point, and it's specific. And again, you stop talking after. We'll get to that and why that's so important in a second. On the next page, we have a few keywords and phrases. And these are just suggestions of how you can tee up your request sentence, right? So their own way of making the ask. Each parishioner is different. We won't go through them right now. They'll be available and up on the diocese website, so you can use them, you can reference them. But we just think these are some helpful phrases that you can play around with that might help you form your own gift request sentence. Okay, so after the request, this is really important. Can we go to the next slide? Perfect. So, as Father Dave said earlier in the conversation, as I just said 2 slides ago, following a gift request, it is so important to pause and provide the donor time to consider your request. This is definitely the most awkward part, right? And where leaders often get nervous or anxious. You know, if you're like me, I have a tendency to just fill silence in everyday conversation, right? Most people have a jerk reaction. They make the request, they start apologizing. It's a little bit awkward, but I promise you, please try to avoid the temptation to jump in with a response. Avoid the temptation to start apologizing for the ask. If they're not saying something, it's because they're processing, right? That's it. It's time to process. They might be trying to work through how they can actually achieve this gift at the requested level, right? In the silence, the Holy Spirit is working. So let them be the next person in the room who talks. Okay. The next slide, please. All right, so there are a number of ways that people might respond after the gift request, right? And you just want to make sure you're prepared to handle all those different types of responses. And here's what we think is distilled down to the majority of responses that you're going to get. I'd be shocked if you receive something that's not on this list. If it is, let me know. We can talk through it. So the first possible response is they say, yes, I'm happy to do that. They agree to the gift. That's an easy one, right? You say, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We're so happy. That's amazing. The impact's going to be transformational. And then in there, you would like to come prepared, hopefully with a pledge card. So you can actually get their commitment in writing. They can sign it. You can go back. You can celebrate it. You can celebrate them. On the very rare occasion, maybe if you're just Father Dave, someone's going to come in and say, yeah, actually, I'd like to do a lot more. It's rare. It does happen. If so, of course, thank you, make a big deal of it. The most likely response is that someone is going to ask for more time to actually consider the request. They're going to want to go back. They're going to want to talk to their spouse. They're going to want to talk to their family. They're going to want to look at their finances, see if it's something they can do, because often in these conversations, you're asking for a sacrificial gift, right? You're asking for someone to really prayerfully consider something that's sacrificial. And that's okay. So you want to thank them for their time, but you always want to leave with a next step. And you want to schedule then a follow-up, ideally within a week, right? You can leave the materials behind, the request, or you can follow up, but sometimes it's helpful to just leave a date marker, right? So you can say, that's terrific, take the time you need. We actually have a vestry meeting coming up in 2 weeks, and I would love, if possible, to receive your decision ahead of time so we can celebrate it at that meeting, or so we can talk about it, right? That can be helpful to just give people a time frame. Or you can just say, please take the time, go back and talk to your spouse about it. I'll give you a call next Tuesday and hopefully receive your decision there, or answer any outstanding questions that you might have, right? It's an opportunity for you to answer some of those questions that they might have after the conversation. What happens if someone offers a little bit less, right? And here's why at the start of the call, I said, you want to go into the conversation knowing what you're going to ask and knowing the amount that you're going to feel still really good about. So maybe if you ask for 12,000 and they come back and say, I can't do 12, but actually I can do 10,000. That might be okay. That might be great. You might feel really good about that. So if that happens, then you can say, thank you so much, right? But sometimes and often you'll ask for 12,000 and someone will say, I can't do that, but I can do 500, right? Chances are you went into that meeting with a really good, you knew that they can give more than that, right? Because you've done your homework, you've had pre-conversations. And so I would say, don't just say yes and thank you if it's significantly different and you truly think that they have the ability to do more. What we would say is just to defer the acceptance of that gift, right? Give them some more time to really think about it. So you can say, we really were not expecting a decision today. Please, take some time, look at the case. This is really important for our church. I'd love to follow up with you next week, and we can have another conversation about it. I can answer any outstanding questions you have, and right. It just gives them some more time to really digest what you were saying and think about it. If someone says no, it's a good opportunity to ask some open-ended questions, right? Were there concerns? Did they respond to objection? Did you respond to objections in a thoughtful and action-oriented way? And again, you might defer that no and say, again, I was not expecting your decision today. I'd love to follow up with you in a week. And then at that time, if they still say, absolutely not, I can't do that, that's okay, right? You want to thank them for their time, but leave the door open for future conversations, because you never know what someone's personal circumstances are. And a no now doesn't necessarily mean no next year. They could be finishing off car payments. They could be their child could be finishing up college. So you might just say, absolutely, I completely understand. Thank you so much for your time. I'd love to just continue to keep you updated about and informed about the projects underway in the event that for future circumstances might allow you to reconsider our request. It's still respectful, it's still appropriate, and you're just leaving the door open for future conversation. Next slide. Thank you. Again, right? No doesn't necessarily mean never. There's a number of reasons why someone may say no now, but it doesn't mean that they can't be asked again, right? They may not have been engaged enough or feel like they have that connection yet to the congregation. Maybe they're a newer parishioner. Maybe their questions weren't answered all that well. And you want to go back and actually say, I thought about your questions some more. I'd love to give you some more information, right? Maybe their financial circumstances will change, or that you didn't know about certain financial circumstances that they had, which is impacting their decision. Maybe what you're asking for is not actually what interests them. Maybe you ask them for support towards your hunger program, but actually they'd be more interested in renovating the stained glass window, right? You just don't know. And it's a good opportunity to find out if it's the actual cause that's the reason. Okay, and then again, just leave the door open. Next slide, please. Closing the gift. This is important, right? You want to know one way or the other. You don't want to just leave it open-ended. If you're saying, wasn't expecting your decision today, you then don't want to leave that open and never receive a decision, right? At some stage, you're going to want to know yes or no. So ideally, you reach that decision in the meeting, but if not, you want to continue to work towards the close in the days, weeks, and very rarely, but sometimes months ahead. And as I said earlier, always try and leave that meeting with a next step, right? Whether it's you're going to meet again next week, you're going to follow up to some of their questions that you didn't actually know the answer to at the moment. Just make sure you know what that next step is and you've both agreed on it. Next slide. So when you don't receive a decision immediately, there's always something you can do to keep the ball in play. And this is not to say that you should be doing all of these things, right? You don't want to overwhelm someone and call them, send them a letter, invite them to an event, send them more materials all at once, right? Let's not overkill. But you do want to continue to build the relationship, deepen the relationship with them. So here are just some ways that you might think about doing that. Next slide. Okay, and finally, here are just a few tips to help you successfully come to that close or to close the gift, right? You want to be clear and reasonable about your expectations, both with the internal team and also with the potential donor. You want to make sure that the person that you're asking has all the details that they need to make an informed decision. So if it's the case materials, maybe it's information about planned giving, if you're talking to them about a legacy gift, right? You want to make sure they understand what's being asked of them. Again, you don't want to drop the ball. You want to make sure you're following up with people in a timely manner. You want to always show your continued thanks and appreciation, whether they're a donor or not, right? It's just so important to always be thankful of someone's time and, of course, their money. Remember, there's always something that can be done. And last but not least, you want to work with people to structure the timing of their gift and the structure of their gift. So you want to be flexible, right? Perhaps some of it could be through a bequest, for example. Perhaps they need to pay a monthly installments on a pledge instead of annually, and that will make this more doable for someone. Or perhaps they might need to start their payments in 6 months from now, but they can actually commit to that today, right? Having that flexibility is going to be really helpful because, again, you don't know what someone's situation is. They could be finishing another donation somewhere else. They could be paying off a loan that they're going to finish in 6 months' time. But if you allow that flexibility, I think you'll have a lot more success. So that is everything we have. We can take down the screen. I know I sort of flew through the second part of that presentation, but I wanted to make sure we got through everything. We have 5 minutes left. Any other questions or thoughts? Did I calm your nerves a little bit, hopefully?
Yes, much better.
Okay,
I'm feeling much better.
good. Kimberly, go ahead.
Carol Ann.
Hi, okay, so we're planning a capital campaign, and we have the numbers because we have 4 things that we need improvements on in the church, and we've gone through all our donors and everything. And does it make sense to we've we've kind of ranked all the top pledgers just generally.
Mhm.
So does it make sense to take like the top couple ones? We were thinking like a 2-year payment kind of thing.
Mhm.
Does it make sense to ask them like double what they give annually in those two, is that kind of a good guideline? You know what I'm saying? So if you give $5,000 a year, should I ask then, since this is for you to double that and give years coming up in addition to your pledge, $10,000? Is that kind of like a ballpark kind of figure when you have their pledging numbers?
It's hard to say. And the reason I'm hesitating is because I think everyone's financial situation is very different. And some people give annually in a way that is already very sacrificial, and some people don't. And some people give in a way that's just comfortable for them. And they do have the ability to do much more. So I think it's a good place to start. If you really have no other idea, and let them sort of tell you whether or not that is worthwhile. But if there are other things you can look at besides just their pledge, like if you know a bit more about their family situation, right? Are there 2 working family members, or is it just 1? Do they have children, and are they still being supported by the family, right? I think some of those factors are going to be helpful as you think through how much higher than their annual pledge you want to ask for, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I'd also
It's also tough, because we are in this pandemic situation, to have conversations, kind of informal conversations, and it's tough.
This is also the gift table can also be really helpful. So, when we advise clergy members who are making major donor requests and they aren't sure, if someone's a top pledger, we usually say, you're one of our most generous and loyal pledgers. We need, in order to reach our goal for this campaign, we're looking at, our donors to support us at these top levels, and whether that's, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000. And so it's not really asking them to support you at that level, but knowing that they're one of your top donors or major donors, that they're more likely to support you at the top levels, is to give them an indication that that's kind of what you're seeking. And then, there is some standards around, and that some standards, around giving 2 or 3 times your annual pledge. And a lot of times if the person asking, whether it's the priest or your campaign co-chair, if they themselves have given that amount, if they can say, I myself have decided to give 2 or 3 times my annual giving. So, we're asking you to also consider that as well. So there are a couple different ways to approach it. If you really aren't sure of what they're able to give and don't want to, and are still in the process of kind of feeling them out.
I will say a lot of people have also had really a lot of success having some of these conversations virtually, right? We know it's certainly easier to have these conversations face to face in a room with someone, but the pandemic has made us all have to adjust a little bit, and so you can have these conversations over Zoom, right? If you want, and you can develop a slide, for example, that just shows, or 2 slides, right? One that shows some of the vision for the campaign. So what does it look like? What are the figures of the campaign? What is it supporting? What is it going to be used for? And then you could have a slide that just shows that table of gifts, and you can share it with them, talk them through it, and then say, so what do you think? Right. And that can be done virtually as well. Caroline?
Yeah, I was just thinking, oftentimes when someone is asking me to make a contribution, they will say, back to my, categories of platinum and gold and whatever, they said, would you like to be a gold giver or a platinum level giver or a bronze level giver, or, whatever. So we could, in my mind, think about putting certain dollar amount in those categories and asking the person, what category would they like to be in? that's to me another way of getting them to commit in terms of a dollar amount, and asking them to, be a platinum giver or whatever over a period of a year or 2 years or however,
Yeah. Okay. So I know we're just a minute past, and I'd just like to reiterate that we are around. If you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We are more than happy to think through strategies with each of you individually, with a group. Just feel free to reach out to us. I think you all have our contact information. If not, I will quickly share it in the chat before we go. So you have my email. And with that, I hope you all have a lovely evening.